This is an LA Times Studios podcast.
My name is Sammy Roth, and I'm the climate columnist for the Los Angeles Times. This is Boiling Point. I've been a professional journalist for 11 years, and this whole time I've only ever written about climate, energy, and the environment. For most journalists, it's the opposite. There are a lot of folks who go 10, 20, even 30 years in this business without writing more than a couple of sentences here or there about the climate crisis, which is pretty crazy considering it's arguably the biggest story of the 21st century. When global warming causes more extreme weather events that affect refugee flows, that's an immigration story. When more intense heat waves reduce labor productivity and make competition unsafe for athletes, that's an economic story and a sports story. When oil companies lobby state legislatures, even as wildfires get bigger and more destructive, that's a politics story. Journalists do a ton of incredible work, and I hope Americans have realized, especially over the last few months, just how important our work is for a functioning democracy. But the truth is that journalists, like everyone else, are not perfect. We have blind spots. And for a long time, climate change has been one of our collective blind spots. There are a lot of reasons for that, and I'm going to get into them this week with Sadie Babits. She's the supervising climate editor at NPR and a former professor of practice and sustainability director at Arizona State University's Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Sadie is also the author of a great new book, Hot Takes, Every Journalist's Guide to Covering Climate Change. As Sadie writes in the book, and I quote, "Climate change is now an essential element in many of the stories journalists must report. I believe every reporter is now, to some degree, a climate reporter," close quote. I would say something similar is true for news consumers. If you read articles or scroll social media or watch videos, you're consuming news about climate change all the time, even if you don't realize it. And that's why I wanted to have Sadie on this podcast. Her book is full of advice that's relevant not just for journalists, but for anyone who cares about climate and how journalists cover it. Hot Takes, which is a great title, by the way, is a seriously fascinating read. And I'm not just saying that because Sadie asked me to write the foreword. I sat down with Sadie last month in Tempe, Arizona, where we were both attending the annual conference of the Society of Environmental Journalists. Here's our conversation.
Hi, my name is Mary Knopf, and I'm a producer on Boiling Point. We are here with Joanne O'Neill, Director of Customer Programs at Clean Power Alliance. Hi, Joanne.
Hello.
Can you tell us a little bit about Clean Power Alliance?
Yeah, so Clean Power Alliance is the not-for-profit electricity provider for 3 million residents and businesses across Los Angeles and Ventura counties.
What renewable energy options does CPA offer its customers?
So Clean Power Alliance offers customers a series of choices between lean power, clean power, or 100% green power to ensure that people have the option to choose a rate that's right for them and maximize their renewable energy.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us, Joanne.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Take the next step in building a more resilient and clean energy future for Southern California. To learn more, please visit cleanpoweralliance.org/power-response. Again, that's cleanpoweralliance.org/power-response.
The weather here in LA is heating up, and beach days are coming up fast, so my need for a new summer wardrobe is stronger than ever. Vacation season is nearly upon us. This year, I'm treating myself to the luxe upgrades I deserve with Quince's high-quality travel essentials at fair prices. Like lightweight European linen styles from $30, washable silk tops, and comfy lounge sets with premium luggage options and stylish tote bags to carry it all. The best part? All Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. By partnering directly with top factories, Quince cuts out the cost of the middleman and passes the savings on to us. And Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices with premium fabrics and finishes. I'm going for an all things linen summer, so my cart is packed with 100% European linen shorts and short sleeve shirts in every color, so I can be cool and confident on the beach all summer long. For your next trip, treat yourself to the luxe upgrades you deserve from Quince. Go to quince.com/dirtyjohn for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/dirtyjohn to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/dirtyjohn.
Sadie, thank you very much for being with us on the Boiling Point podcast.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
So you've been in climate journalism for a long time. I'm curious, what was it that drove you to write this book, to write Hot Takes? What made you sit down and say, okay, I need to write this now?
So I was a professor for about 5 years, and my students kept asking me all these questions about climate change. And I finally was like, I think there's something here. And it actually was an editor who approached me about writing a book. And I had pitched her a bunch of ideas. And she was like, no, none of those. But would you be interested in writing about climate change, your experience covering it, and advice for journalists? And I thought about that for a while and realized that I had something to say and I wanted to help my students. And when I was writing this book, I actually had my students, former students at this point, in mind as I put this book together. So it's essentially this guidebook, a primer of all the things that you need to know on an immensely huge topic, climate change, to help journalists, no matter where they are in their career, no matter what area they're covering, to be comfortable with the science, to avoid some of the pitfalls and also have some hope in the process.
I think that was one of the things I liked most about this book, actually, was that it's not just written for environmental reporters who want to do better climate change coverage. I mean, we're here on the sidelines of the Society of Environmental Journalists Conference, this great event that you and I have both been to many a time. But, you didn't just write this book for us. You wrote it for all journalists who want to cover climate, who should be covering climate. Why did you make that choice to write this for everybody?
I had this moment, Sammy, where it was this realization that climate is in every aspect of our lives. And as journalists, there are so many opportunities to help our audiences understand the impacts of climate change and really connect what I like to call the climate dots. And it isn't just a climate desk in a newsroom and a very specific team of people tasked with covering the effects of climate change and how we adapt to it and resiliency and all of that. It's really in every aspect of the work that we do. So if you are a sports reporter, heat is going to be a really big concern if you're covering football, for instance. Understanding the basics of climate science can really help your audience, whether that's television or radio or newspaper or digital, right? Understand what's going on and why players might find their schedules shifting because they can't practice in their normal times, and that's climate change. And it's a culture story, it's an economic story, it's a policy story, it's a climate story, and it's literally in everything. And so I've had multiple conversations with people who are just scared, quite frankly, of like, it seems so massive. Like, how do you wrap your head around climate change and bring that into a story? And this book ultimately is, I hope, the answer or part of the answer to that, to give people advice of like, here's how simple actually it is to make those climate connections a lot clearer in your stories, regardless of whether you're like covering sports or you're covering culture or you really are on a climate, whether you're really on a climate desk, for instance.
On a positive note, one of the first chapters in your book, you talk about the things that you've seen change in climate reporting over your years in journalism, the things you've seen change for the better. Talk about what you've seen change. How has climate journalism evolved? What has improved from when you first started doing this work?
It's such an interesting question, Sammy, because I started reporting on climate change at a time where climate change was just sort of coming into the zeitgeist. And it was during the days, so this is like early 2000s, where climate change was really sort of this political hot potato. And I was trying to understand why that was. And I don't think at the time I fully realized what was happening. And looking back at some of my own work and work of others, I was like, oh, this is a moment and an evolution that has happened. So
what time period are we talking about?
So we're talking like late 1990s, early 2000s.
Okay, back when there was still a lot of climate denialism going on.
There was a lot of climate denialism, and the approach in media was really to both sides climate change. And I remember editors saying this to me of like, well, okay, so you've got the climate scientist here saying, climate change is real and it's happening, but there are a lot of people who are skeptical about climate change. And to be clear, like, that is not the case. The majority of scientists agree that climate change is happening and it is real. But in those earlier days of climate change reporting, this debate got crafted and added to climate change being this really political issue and really fueling climate denialism. And I'm happy to say that looking at coverage today and over like the last several years, it has gotten it has become so robust. You don't see climate denialists referenced or climate skeptics referenced in stories. It's really multiple perspectives. It's a lot more nuanced. I think stories are a lot more human-centered because climate change impacts all species, including our own. And that's been really refreshing to see. And I think there's the future evolution is looking at, solutions to climate change and actually helping people understand the agency that's out there to climate change, that it isn't all doom and gloom.
All that said, you do devote a whole chapter in your book to debunking misinformation and disinformation to help journalists sort through that stuff. And I think this is really valuable to consumers of information as well, not just the journalists who are sorting through it as reporters. How has the disinformation and misinformation shifted? It's for the most part not outright denialism anymore. What does it look like today if it's not, climate change isn't real?
I think we see it's still rampant, but it has definitely shifted, Sammy, and you know this so well in your own reporting. It's focused on renewable energy and sort of like, I think of in Texas, we had that big winter freeze, and so many people lost electricity.
This is what, 2021, right?
2021, yeah. Right? And, people were in their homes. They didn't have electricity. Things were really tough. And trying to get the Texas grid back up and operating, there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation being brought about with the governor and blaming what happened on renewables, that solar and wind failed. And that didn't happen at all. Actually, it was natural gas powered plants that weren't working properly because it was so cold. And so that's where we're seeing so much misinformation. And you see these fights happening over solar and offshore wind and wind on land as well.
Right, offshore wind is being blamed for like whale deaths in the Northeast. Not even offshore wind, like studies about where to put offshore wind or how to site offshore wind. Exactly,
and that's all misinformation. And so there have been moments where I've thought, this is a little like playing whack-a-mole, and as a journalist trying to truth squad all of this out there. And you can't do that because there is so much in this space. But there are ways that journalists can help people understand what is truth and what is fiction.
Yeah, that was one of the parts of your book I found most interesting, the question of even before how do you do the debunking, like the question of even when do you bother to spend time like debunking something versus just ignoring it? What's your advice on that question? Like when as a journalist or as someone who's sorting through information, because it's journalists who are doing this. It's also just like, I hesitate to even use the term. It's influencers. It's people with platforms on the internet, for better or worse. Sometimes for better. I mean, let's be fair. But when is it worth taking the time to look at a piece of misinformation or disinformation and say, okay, like I'm gonna dig into this and tell people what's real and what's not real versus just ignoring it because you're afraid of amplifying it even further.
I think that's the challenge, right? And the worry of amplifying the myth. And I think it's a really tough question. And I don't have all the answers. I talked to a lot of really incredible researchers on misinformation and disinformation.
And by the way, I should interrupt. Define misinformation versus dis, because
that's great.
Yeah.
Yes,
and this is in your book, but yeah,
let's get clear on that.
Yeah.
I think of misinformation of if my mom were on social media and she saw something and she's like, "Oh, that really is really interesting," and she would like share it around, right? And my mom's not on social media, so she wouldn't do that. But it's sort of like it's unintentional. I think that's the point. You see something, maybe it stacks up with your worldview, and you're like, oh, that's really interesting, right? So let's say it's about offshore wind and whales, and that offshore wind is contributing to whale deaths. That is not the case. You might see that and see it on a Facebook page and then spread it to your followers, and then they spread it to their followers, and it sort of like creates this sort of like echo chamber. And that's really it's kind of innocent in that sense of sort of like, oh, I'm just going to share this, what I think is information out. Disinformation is intentional. This is greenwashing. This is putting a narrative out there and trying to spin it. This is what we know from really great reporting on oil companies such as Exxon. That the Exxon New project, which really exposed the fact that early days, these oil companies knew about climate change research, and they had a moment to decide of like, oh, we could do something with this research, and they decided to downplay it and ultimately like push the blame onto consumers, right?
Gotcha. So maybe the modern day equivalent of that is these sort of faux grassroots groups with ties to fossil fuel industry money running around local communities, spreading lies about renewable energy and solar farms are going to, give you cancer or something like that, which they're not, by the way.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
So talk about the, your thought process then about, to go back to the question that I asked 5 minutes ago before interrupting myself about advice to journalists and people sorting through the news about when do you take the time to debunk versus ignoring because you don't want to amplify the bad information?
I think when there's harm involved, that it rises to a level of taking it on and debunking. That's one way around it, and we can talk about certain ways of going about that, right? If it's out there and everyone is spreading, media outlets are covering, like I think journalists have need to be responsible and take the time to debunk, and it takes time, right? It's a fact check, and you can do that in ways that don't spread the lie or the myth, right? Starting with the headline of a story and getting the truth in the headline right away, so you're not repeating whatever that mis or disinformation is.
So don't do a headline that says, "Do solar farms give you cancer? ? We investigate."
Exactly.
Like that.
Exactly. Right. You'd reframe that to be like, solar farms don't give us cancer, right? And you could just go into the story. I think what's really powerful is we know when people are going to start having questions or around big events, so around the election, for instance, you can get ahead of disinformation by sort of pre-bunking and imagining what your audience wants to have answered and getting ahead of what stories might emerge. So offshore wind, I think, is a really good example of that. We saw this in the last election. The idea of the offshore wind is causing harm to whales, and the research isn't there. And we've done stories about that not being the case and getting ahead of that.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Hi, my name is Mary Knopf, and I'm a producer on Boiling Point. We are here with Joanne O'Neill, Director of Customer Programs at Clean Power Alliance. Hi, Joanne.
Hello.
Clean Power Alliance offers many customer programs to save on electricity bills and conserve energy. What is Power Response? How can listeners participate, and are there any incentives for signing up?
Yeah, so CPA offers various energy and cost savings programs to its customers. One of these programs is Power Response, where participants can earn money for saving energy when energy demand is higher than expected. By saving energy and earning money during these events, Power Response program helps increase the reliability of the power grid and lowers greenhouse gas emissions in the local community.
Well, thank you so much, Joanne.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Take the next step in building a more resilient and clean energy future for Southern California. To learn more, please visit cleanpoweralliance.org/powerresponse. Again, that's cleanpoweralliance.org/powerresponse.
A couple other chapters of your book that I want to ask about that were just so interesting to me, and this one I'll bring up not just because you quoted me in this chapter, but I did enjoy it, that the discussion of objectivity in climate reporting I found really, really interesting. And I'm just going to quote from the book here. You write, let me find the quote here. You talked about just student journalists who were talking about your conversations with them about sort of what is the line between journalism and advocacy when writing about climate change. And You write, we had philosophical debates over the answers to that question. Where does the line between journalism and advocacy get drawn? There isn't an easy answer, ... I refused to declare a political party for years out of fear that someone would call that into question. Was that too far? Probably. However, my views of objectivity have evolved. Anyway, it's an interesting question because my own thinking about this with climate journalism has been that in other areas of journalism, like if you're writing about homelessness, for instance, it's one that always comes to mind for me. I don't think that anyone who writes about homelessness would think that it's advocacy to say, well, I'm writing about homelessness because I want to help solve homelessness. No one wants to see people living on the streets. Everyone wants to get them housed. That kind of goes without question. Same thing with poverty, for instance. We're all writing, anyone who's writing about poverty wants to help people get out of poverty. That's kind of unquestionable. With climate, it's become, and I think this is less and less the case, but it's been this sort of tension within climate journalism of, do we see ourselves as active players in trying to solve climate change, and is that acceptable as a journalist? My answer has always been, yeah, that's of course why I'm doing this job. Like, why is that even up for debate? I absolutely want to be part of the solution, whether you say solve climate change or slow climate change, because and that's more of a linguistic, can we really solve it? No, it's already happening. But I guess I'm curious how your thinking has evolved in that question, knowing that you come from a more traditional journalistic background and upbringing. Where do you see that line today falling between traditional notions of journalism and traditional notions of advocacy? What is your thinking right now, and what sort of advice do you give to your students today and the journalists you mentor about where to stop before journalism becomes advocacy?
No, it's a great discussion topic. I did grow up in a very traditional journalism background, and I took sort of the gold standard of objectivity, of sort of removing self, trying to be as fair and balanced as possible in my environmental stories and covering climate change. And it was hard because I grew up in the West. I have a deep love for...
Remind me where you grew up?
I grew up in Salmon, Idaho.
Oh, wow. Beautiful.
It's a beautiful country surrounded by mountains, the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness. And I grew up outside, and I have always loved the outdoors and the natural world. And I fundamentally care about the future of the planet. And I think in my early days, I would try to sort of just be open and listen to the people that I was interviewing and take in their stories, and then from all different sides, and then craft my audio stories primarily in what I hoped was a really fair, responsible way that left it up to the listener. My background is largely in public radio. Left it to the listener to decide for themselves what their take is on the story. And I think that very classic take on journalism doesn't work today. And it also just doesn't acknowledge journalists as human beings. We care about what we're doing. Both of us, we're sitting here, we both care about the environment and what happens. And it's a big reason for why we do what we do. It's why I do what I do. And I still maintain that you have to be fair. And I think that fairness comes in continuing to listen and bring really good and truthful stories to the air and to digital. But I do think that it's okay to acknowledge that climate change is here. I mean, the science is there. This is all rooted in fact. And I guess in that way, that principle of factual-based reporting, that's not changing at all. So I feel like my whole evolution has shifted. I will say, to come back to the other part of your question about, where is the line of advocacy? I think there are really interesting debates, Sammy, about, how different newsrooms take this on. Like The Guardian came out several years ago and said, we're going to use the language climate crisis.
I think climate emergency even, right?
Climate emergency, yeah. Right? And that in some of the newsrooms that I've been in, that is seen as advocacy. Is that our role to say that? But the science says that. So there's just like these interesting tensions I find. And I tried to grapple with that in my book.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you on the point about fairness. Like, I think that as long as you're still doing your journalistic due diligence and hearing out all sides and giving people all of the truthful, factual, legitimate information, I mean, you don't want to be repeating lies or misinformation if someone is not coming at you with facts or from a good faith position. Like, it's not your job to just repeat bullshit.
Exactly.
But as long as you're being rigorous about it, you've just got to follow where the story leads. And if the story leads to climate change is an existential threat and it's an emergency and it's imperative that if we want to lead healthy, safe lives as individuals and as a species, then it's drastically important that we do something, or it's incredibly important that we do something dramatic about this quickly. That's what you've got to tell people. And I think that's what more and more journalists are deciding. I think that, the other thing that I think about a lot is that, especially the way that social media and video and audio and just the whole technology and information revolution has transformed media, authenticity of voice has become so much more important. Like the way that journalism used to work with the type of attempt to have that neutral voice that you were describing, that worked for previous generations, and that worked in an environment where there were 3 broadcast news stations and 1 or 2 or 3 national newspapers and 1 local newspaper because people didn't have a choice. But now when you can get your news from a million different sources and a ton of news influencers on social media or on YouTube and from Joe Rogan or whichever podcast of your choice, people respond to authenticity of voice and to people who feel like friends or who feel like someone they can trust. So I think if you're not bringing your full self, not every journalist is going to want to or be able to do this, but if you're not bringing some version of your full self to your reporting, if you're pretending like you're not a human being, like you're trying to act like you're, some, anonymous bot who's just, repeating statistics or, transcribing talking points from third parties, people aren't going to respond to that. They're just not going to want that. They're going to reject you and go get their news from someone who might be or probably is less reputable or less likely to give them good information. So I think the more journalists can embrace that and acknowledge, we have a stake in this. We care. We're real. We're not going to sound like the New York Times of the 1950s. No disrespect to them. They did great work. But I think that the more we move in this direction, not to advocacy necessarily, but to bringing our voices and more of our full selves and to acknowledging where we're coming from. And we're still going to do rigorous journalism, but we're going to bring our perspective to it as well. I think that's good for confronting the climate crisis, and it's good for sustaining our business models too.
Well, and I think of your newsletter, the Boiling Point, you have that authenticity and that voice, and is actually in the early days of when you started writing that newsletter that I also I found myself going, I could say more and feel more comfortable about that, because you do create that trust with your readers, right? And I think you strike a nice balance.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
What's it like at NPR these days covering climate change? Obviously, NPR has been in the news a lot with federal funding stuff. But you guys continue to do great climate change reporting, and you're obviously a crucial part of that. What's the atmosphere been like, and what's it like at NPR covering climate these days?
Yeah, so I'm a climate editor at NPR, and we are continuing to cover climate change robustly, rigorously, as we always have, and that's not going to change. There is such a powerful role of journalism. There always has been. At this particular moment in time, I feel like climate journalists have a really important role in getting information, trusted information to people. And we take that very seriously on the climate desk. And so I think that, we are covering climate change in a way that we would regardless of administration. It's the same approach that we've taken with every administration, which is, relying on the facts, talking to scientists, which is increasingly difficult, because scientists are worried about retribution. We're talking with federal workers. We're having conversations, and like so many journalists, trying to bring those stories, those connections to people of, what changes in environmental regulation, climate policy mean for everyone. And that's not going to change.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
How many people do you have on your climate desk?
Okay, hang on. I have to always count this.
Oh, Sadie's counting on her fingers now.
Let's see.
Approximately.
Okay, so let me do. I want to get this right.
Okay.
Okay, so we have 3 other. Then we have.
She's now writing in her notebook.
I know. Like
She's narrating here.
yes. So 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9. I think we're at 9 right now.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, there you go. I did the math.
You counted to 9. I'm proud of you.
Yeah. No, but the other thing I'll mention about this. So we have a really great team at NPR, and we're covering climate solutions. We're covering the intersection of health and climate change, which is such an underreported area. We're covering a lot of accountability in climate spaces, and we're also looking at climate change and the intersection with Indigenous populations as well, with one of our fellows. The other thing is I lead a group of climate reporters from all around the country who work at NPR affiliate stations, member stations. And, we have these weekly calls and we talk through story ideas. And I feel, like we often will bring those stories from local stations to NPR. And it's just such a great way to understand how climate change is impacting across the country. And so that's also a really cool project that we're working on.
And I'm guessing you find that listeners want this stuff.
They do. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And, I don't know if you saw this. I'm sure you did. The new initiative out of Covering Climate Now, the 89% Project.
Yes.
So for folks listening, Covering Climate Now, this great initiative out of Columbia Journalism Review and The Nation magazine, they partner with news organizations across the country to help them provide better climate coverage, basically. And just recently, they launched this initiative, the 89% Project, which is basically trying to focus on highlighting the research that shows that on average around the world, between 80 and 89% of people in most countries want their government to take stronger action on climate change. It's a little lower in the U.S., but still 74% here, which when you think about how hard it is to find bipartisan consensus on anything, 74% is a pretty high number. And in some countries, the number is even above 90%. So I just, I feel like it's important to recognize that, and it sounds like you found this at NPR, people really want to hear about climate change. And I would guess that journalists who are not climate and environment journalists probably would not expect that in the same way that most politicians don't seem to recognize that.
That's so true, Sammy. And we hear that a lot from our audience. Sometimes we'll do call outs and ask people, what they want to know about climate change, which I think is a really good practice for journalists to do. People are interested in what they can do. I find, when we do climate solutions story and look at different ways that people are addressing and companies are addressing climate change, those stories resonate with our audiences. And also just in terms of covering climate disasters and hurricanes, making the climate connection. And I think that that's a really important point at the end of the day is like every time we can, like as journalists, make that climate connection clear in our stories.
And that's a whole chapter in your book, by the way.
That is a whole chapter.
Journalists uncover climate solutions. Another good reason to read the book.
Yes. Yeah. And sort of, I read so much at the end of the day on climate change where I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to just like pull the covers over my head, and but that's not a good way to be, right? And so, how we shape our climate reporting and our stories, it really matters, right? And I think if what would it be like if the tables were turned and the early days of climate journalism weren't so doom and gloom, and that it wasn't so politicized, right? And there wasn't this big debate over climate denialism and is climate real? And what if the story, the body of work from journalists was focused on solutions and a future of the planet that is greener and brighter and lighter and great clean air, all of that. I don't mean to sound Pollyannish, but I think we might be in a different place.
I think we would definitely be in a different place, and hopefully we will be in a different place in the future because of that. I hope.
Yes, I hope.
So one more question. Most people who listen to this are not journalists, but they are people who consume news, who read their newspaper, news organization online, or they get news from social media. In some way, they're consuming news that's produced by journalists in one form or another. If they want to see their local news outlets provide more coverage of climate or better coverage of climate change, what can they do to encourage that? How can they prod or poke or nudge their local journalists and editors to do better on covering climate change? What steps can they take?
That is such a great question. And I think, especially, I work in public media, and the public really matters. And so if you're seeing that and you want stronger coverage or different coverage, or you're curious about a question around climate change and you'd love a reporter to tackle that, I really encourage people to email their local station or get in touch with their digital outlet and say, like, hey, have you thought about doing this story? I'd love to hear this story. Like, I've been following your coverage for a long time. Here's here's something I'm curious about. And I think, like, it's so important to engage with people as journalists, and it can be challenging because we all have really busy lives and deadlines to meet. But some of the best stories come from people who feel motivated to write in, call up, send an email to say, hey, have you thought about this? I think at the end of the day, we're all very curious about, maybe not all. I think at the end of the day, we're pretty curious. And
it's a prerequisite for being a journalist.
Absolutely. And so if somebody reaches out to me with a question, like, I'm going to go explore it and see. And then ultimately, like, maybe there's a story there that you end up hearing, seeing, reading, and connecting with people.
Great advice. Just please don't email me about nuclear fusion again. I'm not going to do that one. Sadie, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast. Hot Takes is out June 2nd. I hope everyone goes and reads it.
Thank you so much, Sammy. It's really great to be here.
Hot Takes, every journalist's guide to covering climate change, will be released by Island Press on June 2nd, 2025. If you want to order a copy, we've got a link in the show notes. Thank you for listening to Boiling Point. I'm your host, Sammy Roth. My producers are Mary Knopf and Jonathan Shiflett. Sound design and original music by Jonathan Shiflett. Elijah Wolfson is our editor. Denise Callahan is our studio manager. Ben Church is our production manager. Nick Norton is our engineer. Special thanks to LA Times studio president Anna Magzanian, president and chief operating officer of the Los Angeles Times Chris Argentieri, and executive editor of the Los Angeles Times Terry Tang. Boiling Point is executive produced by Darius Derrickson and created by me, Sammy Roth.
Ever wonder where your water comes from? What it really means to break up with fossil fuels? Or what life might look like in the year 2100? Our friends at the Sierra Club Angeles chapter, in collaboration with Stranded Astronaut Productions, dive into those questions and more in a new podcast called The Climate Dispatch, launching April 22nd, just in time for Earth Day. Hosted by Taya Jeanette, the show brings together voices from across the climate movement to share stories, fears, and hopes for the future, all through the lens of Southern California. Guests include Nayeli Kobo, Tori Stevens, Aru Shainia J, and Allison Chin. Plus, each episode features music from a local LA band. Listen to The Climate Dispatch at sc.org/Climate Dispatch or wherever you get your podcasts, streaming weekly starting April 22nd.
The LA Times sports video series, Dodgers Debate, is coming to your podcast app on March 28th. Tune in for banter, analysis, and hot takes from me, Dodgers beat reporter Jack Harris, and sports columnists Bill Plaschke and Dylan Hernandez. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.